So at this point, I think it's time that we start working on fetching our routines that are stored in the database. And we're going to write two queries. One which is going to fetch a routine based on its ID, as well as one query which is going to fetch every routine that's created by a single user. So from now on, every user is going to have their unique routines page, and they're only going to see the routines that they themselves have created. So I've made a few changes to the code. The first thing I did was I added a user ID to the routine, so we're able to sync a user with a routine. As well as in my create routine resolver, we've also added this now so that for each routine that we're creating, we're gonna pass the currently signed in user so we can sync them up in the database as well. And after that, what I did was I created my two routines, the two queries for fetching the routines. One's to fetch a single routine in which you pass an ID for the routine, as well as getting every routine. And I think the most relevant would be the get routines. So what we can do, what we do here is we call a routine, and we want to find many. So that what happens is that Prisma is going to find many results and return an array which matches a certain predicate. So it kind of filters them. And that predicate is that the user ID is the same as the context ID. And then we can just check if we have found anything in the array and it has returned successfully. Then we can just return it. Otherwise, we're going to return null. So what we can do now is save that, for instance, that we want to create a routine. So maybe we want to create an evening routine. And then you maybe want to start, I don't know, 1112. And we create, and then we create an evening routine. And if we check our Prisma database, we can see that now for our routines, we're going to have this user ID, and it's going to be linked with this table. And that's what we set up by adding the user as user ID in this schema. And now we're also able to fetch the routines by calling this get routines query. And if we run it, we can see that we get the array of the routines that this specific user has created, because it's going to use my session ID to figure it out. So at this point, we're able to both write routines into the database, as well as retrieving routines from the database by using our API. So the next step that I want to work on is the actual front end. So I want to create a component that lets us call this mutation to write and store routines by using a front end UI. And then I also want to create I want to use this query to fetch all the routines that the user has created to display it to them. Okay, so I thought I'd show you what I've been working on. And I've been working on this routines page. So whenever you visit this page now, you're gonna see something along the lines of your routines and a little bit of template text and this. And it's obviously not going to look like this in the end, but this is just a placeholder to show you. I've also added React Query, which is a library for querying and caching your results when you query your backend. So if we open the dev tools and we reload this page, we're going to see that it's going to fetch the data and it's going to show an error. No, it's not going to show an error, it's going to show a loading. So if we do here, we're going to see it went super quick, but it said loading and then it shows the data. And now we can see that the data is stored here in our cache and it's fresh. And what's super cool here is that if we go to our sign in page now, for instance, we can see it disabled. But if we visit our routines again, you'll see that the data is instant, because it doesn't have to make that round trip to the API to fetch all the data because it's fresh. So what happens is that the data is shown instantly, and that creates a super nice user experience where you don't have to make a synchronous request for the data each time because it's already stored. And what's even better is that if we have set up GraphQL CodeGen, we can actually generate these hooks. So this is the entire thing that gets the data for us because the rest is generated. So what we do is, I've shown you previously how I created this test GraphQL, which is worthless. But I copied the getRoutines query, which we have created to fetch all the things that we need. And then when we run our GraphQL code generator with our generate command, we get this use getRoutines query. And all that you really need to do is pass the request client for saying how the GraphQL is supposed to be fetched. And you can use Axios, you can use fetch, whatever. I'm using GraphQL request client. And that's pretty much it. So you're gonna get the data, you're gonna get an isLoading state, which you can use to, for instance, show this. I only have text for now, I'm probably gonna show a spinner. And you also can get an error state if there was some issue with your request. And that's pretty much it. So for now, we can fetch all the data from our backend to show all the routines for the user that they have created. And now we just need to style it a bit better. So I'm gonna take a break for a little while because my head is pretty fried at the moment, and I've been sitting on this problem for a couple of hours now. And what it comes down to is that I have this query which fetches all the routines for a user. And when I create a new routine, I only want to update the cache, and because the simple solution would be to invalidate the entire request and refetch it. But I'd much rather just update the cache directly and not having to do that round trip to the server again. And I can't for the life of me figure out how to do that properly. So I'm gonna go out for a walk and get some fresh air for like 15 minutes, and then hopefully I can come back and maybe I can solve it. Yes! Oh! Oh! Good! So the code for creating a routine from the front end is now finally done, and it took quite a while. So what we have now is we have a button which can have two states. It can either be inactive, which it is now, or it can be active, which happens when you press on it. So here what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to enter your time which you want the routine to be active. So maybe we want it to, I don't know, 5:30 to 6:30, and we can call it wake up routine. And when we press create routine, we're gonna send a mutation. We're gonna send a request for a mutation to the backend. And if we check our Prisma now, we can see that we have a wake up routine, and we can see that it's also been added to the UI. Okay, so what happens in the code? I guess that's the most important part. I guess there's quite a bit, but I'll spend my focus on what I've been struggling with and what I think is most important. So when you use GraphQL CodeGen, you can create, you can generate these hooks, both for queries and mutations. So we have a create rotation mutation, a use create routine mutation. Yeah, it's a tongue twister. And it has 4 callback methods. It has an onSuccess, it has an onMutate, and onMutate is going to be ran before the on success, it has an on settled, which you can think of it as a final block in a try-catch block, and it has an error method as well. But anyway, the thing that I've been struggling with and what I wanted to solve is that so when you have a request, which we can check here, we have a get routines, and I don't want to invalidate that entire request and send a new request to the backend every time we create a new routine. So I'd much rather just update the cache manually and not having to do that round trip to the server back and forth. So what I ended up doing is I used the query client to call get query data, and what we're gonna get in return is this. We're going to get all these routines which are active. So with that, we're going to take those routines and spread them into a new array, and we're gonna append this new routine which you have just created and is being sent as a response from the GraphQL API back to us. And then we're just gonna manually update the cache with this new array. Otherwise, if this data isn't defined, in other words, if this is stale, we're just gonna invalidate the queries and refetch everything. And I think that's fine, because at that point it's stale anyway, so we might as well refetch it. But this solves the problem that we don't have to invalidate our queries every time we create a mutation to get this new routine showing in the UI. So that's kind of what I wanted to solve. I wanted the new routine to show up in the UI without having to invalidating the entire query. And yeah, so it's solved now. So at this point, I'm very happy to end the video here. We have created 2 queries to fetch data that's going to be used in our front end. We've also created the UI for actually sending the mutation to the backend. And we've also made sure that our cache is updated properly and we don't have to invalidate things if we don't actually need to. So yeah, thanks for watching and stay tuned.